Behind the Knife, the surgery podcast. Relevant and engaging content designed to help you dominate the day. Thank you, as always, for listening to Behind the Knife. This is Patrick Georgioff. We love our APP colleagues, and we know that you do too. But when we surveyed the barren landscape, there wasn't a single high-quality surgical education resource made just for NPs and PAs. And that's why we created Dominate Surgery for APPs. This kick-ass resource has it all, from core, rotation-specific knowledge to practical tips and tricks like how to present a consult, insert a laparoscopic port, and find your first job. It contains short, high-yield text, beautiful illustrations, tons of practical audio, and professional-grade videos. Group discounts are available. Now, enjoy the episode and dominate the day.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to the Behind the Knife series about artificial intelligence. I'm Ayman Ali, a general surgery PGY4 at Duke. In today's conversation, I'm joined by fantastic guests to discuss the ethics of artificial intelligence in surgery and medicine and healthcare in general. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ryan Antill, who's an associate professor of pediatric surgery here at Duke, and whose research addresses ethical challenges surrounding the care of seriously ill fetuses and neonates. In addition, he's the founder of The Good Surgeon, which is a project that focuses on character development in surgical trainees and faculty. Welcome, Dr. Antill.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you all.
I'm also joined by members from Oregon Health and Science University, who have been on this podcast before. First is Phillip Jenkins, a PGY4 research fellow.
Hey, thanks for having us back.
We also have Dr. Ruchi Thanawala, a thoracic surgeon with a background in AI and informatics.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Dr. Stephen Bedrick, an associate professor of biomedical informatics and machine learning researcher.
Hey, thanks so much for having me back.
And finally, we are very lucky to have Professor Kate Spector-Baghdadi, a lawyer and bioethicist at the University of Michigan Medical School. As we were thinking about this episode, it became clear that we would benefit strongly by having somebody with an understanding of the legal principles. And so again, thank you for taking the time to join us, Professor Spector.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So before we start with the general discussion, I just want to start with the case, as we often do in medicine. I want you to imagine that your hospital just signed an agreement with a computer vision company that specializes in laparoscopic real-time analysis. It's 2:30 in the morning, you get called to do an urgent lap chole on a 32-year-old woman, and the real-time overlay highlights the cystic duct. You place the clip, you divide the common bile duct, and it's a very long road ahead for the patient. At the end of the day, it is the culture in medicine that most of us will take responsibility. But from each of you, I want to hear your immediate thoughts about this case. How does it make you feel with respect to each of your backgrounds and perspectives? I think maybe we can start with Dr. Bedrick. How do you feel as a builder of tools?
Oh, first of all, that is the nightmare scenario for anyone building any kind of, automation tool used in a medical context, right? The idea is to help avoid errors and make things easier for providers, not cause those kinds of problems. So, my first thought hearing that is to think about, first of all, what went wrong from the tool's perspective, and but also to think about when it was deployed and put in the hands of the people using it, what kind of training did they have to understand how much trust to put in that overlay, right? So I think about automation bias, and I think about, what the developers maybe could or should have been doing differently in their testing. And also keeps me up at night worrying about that kind of stuff.
Dr. Bedrick, I think you bring up some really important points, which is what was in the minds of the people using the tools. And I think, me being a surgeon, I think about all these times where we actually have unsureness. Like, what is the structure? Like, rarely does the anatomy just pop out, you say, and this is what I am and I'm nothing else. And how these new technologies and computer vision tools can be beneficial, but can also add to the complexity of decision-making in already complex situations. And how do we kind of get things to align? So I think there's a lot. I think almost all of us as surgeons can empathize with what has happened in this case, and then try to figure out how do we really leverage these amazing tools to help us make decisions better in hard circumstances and try to mitigate what the algorithm perhaps couldn't have known. There's only but so much information the algorithm had. And as a surgeon, I'm having to now piece together all these additional pieces of information in addition to what we're kind of trained to do, which is just look at the anatomy as we see it.
Dr.
I think
Thanawala, I wanted to kind of advance the scenario a little bit, and especially as an attending surgeon who has trainees, how do you view this when your trainee makes the mistake as opposed to you, which will, as we start to train on these sorts of technologies, residents are going to have to train on it. So now we have that kind of extra layer of complexity of not only did the algorithm make the mistake, but then it's the trainee who actually physically clipped and cut it. Does that change the way that you view the scenario, or how or does it elevate your level of fear about these sort of things?
I think this is a super interesting point, and I think it's things that we think about when, which is the impact on education and learning when we use these artificial intelligence tools in clinical practice. I stand with the position that we need to be able to know how to make these decisions without the adjunct of the tools, because how will we know if the recommendation is right or not if we don't have a baseline knowledge of what to do and what not to do, when to believe and when to disbelieve? So I think, Phil, you bring up an excellent point. We are at a place where not only do we need to teach about the anatomy and the approaches to do these operations, but how to actually effectively use these tools and know when we go with what it's saying and when we don't go with what it's saying. I think in that situation, knowing that the trainee may have, had the hands on the tool, clipping the duct, me as the attending, I still hold the responsibility. I am the responsible faculty in the room and should be knowledgeable about how to integrate all these tools, guide the learner, guide the clinical, decision making and practice as well. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll also add, as a lawyer, obviously my first thought is, as to the liability of this, it's interesting, many of the questions that I would ask if that doctor then came into my office and was like, please defend me in this lawsuit, is whether they had other visibility or line sights to the anatomy that weren't sort of directed by AI, and whether they were supposed to be checking, right? Was the AI tool just sort of an enhancement or an add-on, but you're supposed to confirm with either visual or other tools, and they were using it incorrectly? Or did the AI analysis actually blind them to being able to see the anatomy in a different way? And those are the kinds of things that would really, I think, dictate who holds a liability in this kind of case.
And sort of on a broader picture, when you're talking about tools like this, I think inevitably we are going to have these cases. And so kind of broadly thinking, how do you choose which tool gets deployed? Because I think ultimately, by definition, they're all going to have sensitivities, specificities. They will all have positives and negatives. And I'm interested, maybe first in you, Professor Spector, and then Dr. Antiel, is what if a patient comes to you now and a patient says, I just got injured and I think now it has to do with them using AI. How do you go about that? Does that change at all how you approach this situation?
Yeah, I mean, so when you talk about choice, I don't think that there's actually going to be a lot of choice in the system, right? So when you work at a hospital, the hospital picks out the tools you have access to, and some hospitals have access to better tools, and some hospitals have access to less, highly advanced tools, whether you have a robot doing surgery, whether you have one person trained on it versus 10 people trained on it. All of these are decisions that hospital systems make every day. And, I don't think AI is going to be exceptional to that. The hospital is either going to buy the tool or not and expect certain people to use it or not. And so the flexibility might actually be quite low at the individual practitioner level. If you then sort of go down a deeper level and talk about the patient, will the patient be able to opt out or opt into using this tool? One, patients never have the right to demand any specific care if the practitioner feels like it's inappropriate, or any particular tool if the clinician feels like that's not the right tool to use. So they won't have a right to demand AI. I think a really more complex ethical question is going to be do they have the right to say, I don't want AI used in my care, if that's what people typically are using, right? So it's like the patients that always come in and say, I want the chair of surgery to do my surgery. And, the residents are like, oh, no, you don't. Right? Like, do you really want, and I don't mean that at Duke in particular, just generally speaking, do you really want your surgeon who's trained with an AI tool to do it without? And like that in of itself could be another kind of liability issue.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting is we're constantly using various tools as well as relying on each other to try to prevent these sort of errors and see more clearly. And the patients are oftentimes not privy to that. For example, I don't know if a lot of surgeons are consenting patients to use ICG to try to better illuminate the bile ducts and things like that, right? And so we're constantly using various tools. But what's interesting in this case is despite the use of those tools, whether it's a robot or a laparoscopic technique, whether it's an adjuvant like ICG to help us better see the bile ducts, the final decision where to cut, where to clip, where to cut still kind of lies within the surgeon's purview, which is why, for example, we don't place blame on a trainee when the attending surgeon is standing right there and says, yep, go ahead and clip there. We expect that that individual and their demonstrated knowledge and expertise is such that they then take on that responsibility for that trainee. So this makes a really interesting new area when the recommendation is not from, say, a colleague or from your attending surgeon or from, faulty or view or whatnot, but you're getting input that might be inaccurate. And again, I think the point that everyone has really been making, which I think is so important, that at the end of the day, the patients are coming to you as the surgeon because not just because you can employ a particular technique to solve a particular medical problem, but they're trusting that you have some sort of ability to make judgments, to adapt, to improvise as needed. And so they're trusting at the end of the day that your reputation and your judgment is sound to try to mitigate those sort of errors or mistakes. And so when you're getting input from a source that now, directed you in the wrong way, becomes really an interesting problem.
I just want to add, it's a fascinating thing to think about how these tools are applied. If we think about software versus hardware, I'll create that first division first. Software has this ability for high throughput, rapid scalability, implementation, much faster than hardware. So if we think about hardware in the surgical setting, stents, implants, all these sorts of things that actually require a representative from the device company to be in the room and to actually train the user, the surgeon on the tool. The conversation we're having, I think, is one of the challenges we have is, our computer vision AI models will have excellent performance, but we are not able to keep up with the dispersion rates of how it's being implemented to make sure that the users actually know how to use it. And I think this is the challenge. We will have excellent models, excellent performance, and we will have surgeons and clinicians who don't know how to use it. And I think it's the fundamental difference between software deployment in the healthcare environment versus hardware implantable device development in the healthcare environment.
And, another angle to that is software can evolve and change, right? I've heard people who use ambient scribes talk about how they can tell when the ambient scribe companies have changed the model because their notes suddenly sound different, or they're more formal or less formal or whatever, which normally in medical software, that is like a giant no-no, and users will come to you with pitchforks and torches if your software does that to them. But we're now seeing that for AI-powered software, people are way more tolerant of those kinds of behavior, changes than maybe they historically. That's another piece to it, right? Not only can the software be put out there a lot more quickly, it'll have the capability of evolving and changing. Why is that important? It's because as users get accustomed to one modality of use, the kinds of situations where the kinds of visual or anatomical situations where it does or doesn't, accurately identify the right bile duct, their mental model of how the software works could actually change or become inaccurate, maybe is a better way to put it, with software changes, and they might not even realize that happened. So I think that's a particular angle on AI in this space that we need to try to think about managing that or training for that.
I think one interesting question that you all raise is in terms of training and regulation, to what extent should the hardware and software sort of paradigms follow each other? I'm thinking of, for example, to use the gallbladder example further, when laparoscopy was first introduced for the removal of the gallbladder, cholecystectomy, we saw as the uptake increased, enormous rates of bile duct injuries and things like that. So the problem wasn't the hardware. The problem was folks weren't properly trained to use it, understanding its limitations, etc. And it really required moratoriums, for example, before people kind of stopped and recognized what was needed in terms of training in order to be competent in this new modality, even though you were doing the quote same procedure. I wonder if any similar sort of regulation at the hospital level or at a higher level will take place in terms of the utilization of software as well.
I think all those points are incredible. I mean, especially the point of software versus hardware and actual having reps. I think for those of us that are in the OR, we're very familiar with having reps just stand there. And it's actually something you don't see for things like overlays or AI models and other scenarios. And I kind of wonder, we maybe should have that. And I think the companies do it for multiple reasons, and liability is a part of that. And they always say, you can use that stapler, but it's really not meant for that. And we do not advise that, right? But nobody does that for this stuff. And I think we see it deployed so fast. And we talked about this on a prior episode, but people don't quite understand what these models don't do. And I think that becomes a problem. So, you do a CT scan of the head, and maybe the model is not trained to pick up a tumor, and it never will. Maybe it will only ever look for your subarachs or your subdurals, and it will never mention a tumor. And so if you don't understand that concept, then you can't use the tool properly, regardless of how good it is at the task it's marketed for.
Yeah, I'll also add, like, that is assuming that the sales rep has any idea what the device is doing and could explain it to you, right? So I used to be an attorney for a medical device company and train drug reps who stand in the ORs and help surgeons and explain how the tools are used. But these tools, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more later, like many of them are trained on black box models. And they start acting in ways that are potentially unpredictable, or they get trained on data and people are not really sure why it's coming out with certain outcomes. And when you go back and you sort of try to go spelunking through the analysis and figure out what happened, you're realizing the device is being trained on data that you wouldn't have wanted it to be. So I think already we're making an assumption that if we plunked somebody from one of these companies in the operating room, they would have any idea more than we do, which is definitely not always true.
That's a really important point. And, Dr. Ansel mentioned regulation. I think this is actually a place where we do need to have some kind of regulatory framework in place. There's people have had a lot of different ideas of what regulation for AI software in the space might look like. There's a number of different models, and I don't pretend to know which is the best approach, but I think this is exactly the kind of scenario where we do need that regulation. If for no other reason than, to Ayman's point, like hospitals that buy the thing have a lot of transparency into what did the vendors think it could do, what did they think it could not do, what are they willing to actually stand by in terms of use cases. I would love it if there was some enforced transparency on what sort of data was used for training. I don't know that it always needs to be like a super heavy-handed, you need a phase 3 RCT kind of scenario, but something where people actually can reason about what kind of data went into this, I think would be key to avoid some of these kinds of things that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think almost despite being, loving this space and really loving AI and deployment, I think I almost fall conservative in that I almost think that maybe there should be a phase 3 trial for every AI tool that impacts a patient,
I mean,
there should be.
I think conservative is good in this space, to be honest. And when you have a whole industry and zeitgeist pushing so hard in one direction, it's worth asking why and wondering whether the interests of the patients are being best served by that push. And I think we're seeing very significant pushes for adopting all of the things now. Why stop and think about it? Just do it. You don't want to miss out. And we need to push it back against that inevitability, I think. So conservative is good.
I think it's also worth mentioning that other industries, my experience in aviation, they go through extreme measures to not change things too much because pilots have to be recertified. So the reason why there's a 737-900 and a MAX and it's still a 737 is because airlines don't want to have to send their pilots back through retraining for a new platform, even though most Boeing aircraft fly very similarly. In this world, we are now introducing something completely and radically new to a surgeon's toolkit that, as we've shown in our lab, that most surgeons are not informaticians and have not been trained in this and don't even have the appropriate background to be able to identify these tools. So for the panel, we're asking surgeons to not just use a new stapler, we're asking them to completely train basically in how the future of surgery looks. And with that being led by industry in particular, Dr. Bedrick, I know that you're at AMIA and we had a lot of conversations about this. Where does that fall into everyone's, I suppose, fear radar, I guess would be a word for it, but scope?
I'll just make a small point, but it's not even retrained because we still aren't training in medical school yet on how to use these tools. So like everybody's going to be needed to train from the ground up. Like I was just on my first panel on integrating AI into clinical medicine at the University of Michigan Medical School. And it's not because we're behind.
I think it's a really underappreciated and now like growingly becoming more appreciated how far we are behind on the education of the people that are entering healthcare. And, we're just talking about physicians. AI is, within our ICU care for the nurses, for like, all of the care teams that really constitute our entire healthcare system. And I think we actually need a very unified approach on how to explain, understand, and most importantly, question these algorithms. And just as we say, outline when it's what it doesn't know, what we may not get from industry. And I think if we're being very honest, one of the challenges we have is the fact that these algorithms and these softwares are so expensive to develop. A lot of the power lives within industry. I think we often very successfully partner with industry. But I think in this situation, we are honestly somewhat at odds in the sense of, fast, rapid deployment is of benefit to industry, but may sit counter to our responsibility to an individual patient. And the transparency and explainability that we may demand in the healthcare academic environment, for the algorithms we developed, how do we bring that counterbalance and have that sort of accountability in industry? And I think the only way is to educate all of us that are in healthcare, even more to ask the right questions of, industry-driven algorithms and things. The partnership is important. I think we just need to be a balance to each other.
And I also think that goes to, so as I mentioned, I used to be an FDA attorney, how it goes to sort of a favorite pastime of many people is to say, well, FDA should do this better. But, FDA got thousands of applications involving AI. And it would take its entire workforce, not only to evaluate all of the novel applications of AI in the tools themselves, but think of all the AI that's being used to develop the data that then is informing as research new tools that are being developed that are not necessarily AI in and of themselves. I mean, there's no way FDA can control it, and its purview is somewhat narrow, right? So if you're not submitting a new drug or device or exemption to FDA, it doesn't necessarily have authority over you to ensure that you act in certain ways. Like its purview is not all of AI that might be used in a hospital. So really, just as Dr. Thanawala was saying, it really is going to require both academia and industry and private hospitals to think more holistically about how we're going to govern as opposed to just regulate this space.
And I'm glad you brought up the governance piece because that's something else. There's that gray area of stuff that it's easy to say, okay, stuff that needs to be FDA approved. If it's not approved, we don't use it. But then there's this whole gray area of things that maybe don't need to be, but the hospital might still have ideas about whether they want to be the ones to try this for the first time or let somebody else try it for the first time. So we have an AI governance committee here at OHSU that, in theory, when somebody wants to try a new AI powered thing or buy a new AI powered thing, we have a committee that, we have an intake process. We've worked out what are the questions we have. It is fairly basic things that we try to find out from vendors, or that we try to get whoever department wants to buy the thing to find out from the vendor. And, we decided early on that we could not be the AI police and keep people from doing any AI stuff. And we didn't want to be, but we did want to make sure people were asking questions like, hey, how did they evaluate this? When they say it's 99% accurate, how did they come up with that number? Did they bother to look to see if it has differential performance on people with different colored skin or different, accents or whatever? And, 9 times out of 10, the answer is no, they didn't. And then we get to have more conversation about, well, in this use case, how big of a concern is that? And we can make a more informed decision as an organization. And it's not perfect. We're still trying to figure out our process and work all the kinks out. But, I think over time, there may become more kind of standardized norms of how to do that as this goes on longer and more places start to do things like this. So maybe some kind of middle ground of governance, because having the FDA do all of it is just not feasible.
Yeah, and I'm really glad Dr. Bedrick brought up this point, because I think it's really important that even if FDA does all of the analysis and it does meet the metrics for reliability, that's only in the population on which it's trained. And the whole point of these AI tools is to distribute them globally, or at least nationally, and in particular to communities that don't otherwise have access to some of the basics of care that we do in our, well-educated, wealthy college towns. And what does it mean? And when you take a tool that's trained in one population, like we know currently 72% of AI tools being used in medicine are trained in academic medical centers from Massachusetts, New York, and California alone. What happens when we take those tools and we embed them in rural America or in highly urban areas? What does that mean? And we've seen this happen also in like pharmacogenomics, because most of my work is in genetics, where we would take a drug that was optimized for the study population, which often was largely European, and then distribute it in other populations like Hawaii, which has a much lower European ancestry rate. And what they found actually was that genetic variation associated with being a Pacific Islander or other Asian ancestries meant that this drug was actually less effective in these populations. And the governor actually sued the drug manufacturer to say, you were advertising and tried to get on our Medicaid list just as any other drug does, but your drug doesn't work in our population. And so I think we're going to have many such moments in AI.
Thank you so much for that excellent example, Professor Spector. I think that is a really strong point. This reminds me a little bit about OpenAI. And for those that don't know, they originally started off as a nonprofit, and their entire mission was to democratize artificial intelligence and to make it available to everybody and really focus on the ethical challenges of artificial intelligence as they deployed. What it ended up with is ChatGPT, and a for-profit organization that has sort of put those ethical concerns to the side. And we've seen that with our first AI liability case, which Professor Spector and I were chatting about before this podcast started. And so what I'd like to discuss next is data itself. And I want to start with Dr. Antiel and Professor Spector, because your work is focused on genome. And at least to me, having somebody's DNA is a very valuable part and very intimate part of their data. And so many companies are collecting this and using it, and we don't have much of an idea of where that data goes. And down the line, you can foresee a data breach or something else where a company sells off this data and it becomes consequential to the individual whose data it originally was. So I'd like to hear, what are your thoughts about that, Dr. Antiel and Professor Spector?
Yeah, that's a great question. To what extent do individuals consent to their genetic information being stored? What responsibilities do the institutions or the companies who are using that have down the road when new hypotheses are generated? And is there any way for individuals to even understand where, what's learned from their own information? In other words, like once you sign that paper and that information is entered into these large databases, what does the company, what does the hospital, what do the investigators owe you in down the road? These are really, really hard questions, and people are struggling with them with the use of genomic information. And I think using AI could raise some really interesting questions as well. Like, to what extent will patients consent for their information to be part of these large learning modules? And to what extent are we then responsible to relay that which we learn from these things back to those individuals? Will there be, to Dr. Bedrick's point, in terms of governance, will consent for this be mandated, and who's going to do the mandating? How does one opt out versus opt in? Lots of really difficult and important questions ahead of us.
Yeah, and I think that there's so many companies using data, and it exists in all its forms. And I think even Dr. Thanawala, if for those that don't know, you have Firefly, and that's access to, if you had a evil mind, then it would be access to every single surgical resident's portfolio and their EPAs in every single case that they've done and how they've performed. And you can imagine that if somebody had all this data with bad intentions, it could go very poorly. Insurance reimbursements or things like that down the future. So I'd love your perspective as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to be within the intention of the developers. So kind of going to Dr. Antiel's point and what you're asking, the data is so foundational to these models. Some would say, like, you make the patient buy back, you make the resident, you make someone buy back information that is founded on their data. How ethical is that or not? Like, that data was required to derive the knowledge. Should we be making patients charge or people pay to know what we learned from their information? No. So I think, like, for me as the developer of Firefly and having this, what is sensitive information, you have to really take care of it. And it has to go back to the right individual, and it has to benefit the right people. And there has to be a lot of intentionality within that. I think this is where there's a lot of power in the people who are developing this. And this is where there is a true power imbalance. And how we mitigate that and navigate that, I think this is where all the success and all the failure is actually going to be.
I just to emphasize that something that you just said, when you said, should patients have to pay for products that were trained on their data? No. I felt like all of the major AI manufacturers just like rolling over in their graves, right? I mean, like, that's not how any of this has ever been structured. It's also not how drugs or devices have been structured, right? Like, not only do patients then have to pay for future access to the drug, sometimes there's a donut bowl between the clinical trial and when the drug becomes approved that they can't even pay for it. I think it's a really interesting concept. I'm not sure how it would be rolled out, but I think intellectually it's very interesting. I've done some research where we were interviewing a bunch of hospital systems about how they were rolling out AI, and we interviewed one person who said, if patients are part of these trials, it's really benefiting them if we share their data with industry, because then they have access to products that are less expensive. And we're like, really, that's interesting. We've never heard of anybody be able to proceduralize that. How do you do it? And he is like, well, they're just cheaper. And we're like, well, isn't it usually like a insurance reimbursement, like, package kind of thing? How is this cheaper? And, like, at the end of the day, the punchline is, of course, that they weren't. It was just sort of wishful thinking, because that is very complex to proceduralize. But I agree, is a really interesting goal.
And I think while we may not be able to ever proceduralize it, I think if we at least empower the patients, the healthcare providers, to know that their data is part of the system, we can at least have the conversation. We may not be able to get anything out of it, but we can then have balance and say, you know what, how much of my data went into developing this? How do I actually, use that? How are you using that? How do I make sure that it's being done responsibly, since I'm essentially part of your system now?
And, I think framing it that way is, I think that is really important, because, there's a lot of things where there's this sort of very diffuse benefit that, the person, it's easy to look at it and say, well, in some big picture cosmic sense, yes, the existence of a better predictive model for whatever is beneficial in some way that might trickle down to the, And that's kind of diffuse and fuzzy and hard to pin down. It's very easy to say the existence of that model makes that company a bunch of money, right? Like that's really easy to see where the benefit is, and it's really easy to see where the costs are. So in those kind of situations where there's that mismatch, that's where we do need a regulatory framework of some kind. And even if that regulatory framework is largely built around protecting people from harms rather than making sure they accrue benefits, right? We do that sometimes in other realms in medicine, and maybe we need something like that here, right? We have a lot of genetic privacy laws. Maybe there need to be, which in theory anyway are supposed to make it so your insurance company can't buy information that you might get about your genome from someone else who's not supposed to have, maybe there could be some analogs here for these kinds of things. I personally have twitched a little bit when I've heard hospitals say the same thing, like, oh yes, by leveraging our archive of patient data, we're going to make a bunch of money, and that's going to like keep us in business, and so that's beneficial for our patients. And I always kind of twitch a little bit about that. Like maybe we could give patients like a discount on their premium or something if they agree to have their data be sent to the shared in this way. But I also would like a pony. So we have, we all have dreams, but maybe there's some opportunity.
Precedent for that in wellness programs, right? So wellness programs, you can get a discount on your employee-based insurance if you, do things like go to the gym or share data or quit smoking. So there's a little bit of a precedent for that. Although I will say in terms of regulating and requiring anti-discrimination. So I'll show my cards and just say that I used to work for the Obama administration and help policy for his bioethics commission. And under the Biden administration, I also helped consult for his executive order, which did a lot of things in the space of AI, including trying to prohibit discrimination in at least models that were being put out by the executive department. That is not the direction that the government is headed right now. And I think the most recent executive order was called Preventing Woke AI, was actually prohibiting assessments for discrimination. And so that's something that industry and academia are going to have to do themselves right now if it's going to happen.
Just to add, there's a new one this week that revived Ted Cruz's attempt to ban state regulation of AI and algorithmic decision making, which is, I don't really have words to say how catastrophic that would all be. This is a space where regulation is needed, and it might be something that does need to happen at the state level. So for there to be federal, since we're putting cards on the table, this is where professional norms and community norms within industries and healthcare fields, we've seen norms hold up in how different parts of the healthcare system have done certain things over the last year to protect patients and protect our integrity as a field. And maybe this is a space where we should be developing more, more industry and field-wide norms.
I completely agree. I think that we need, at least within our hospitals and in industry, to take that responsibility upon ourselves. Now, unfortunately, the penalty of having such an incredible panel is that some people have to go in a few minutes. So just to wrap it up, maybe we can each go around and in a sentence, maybe say, what gives you hope about the future of AI in medicine? And then what keeps you up at night? I really wish we had another 3 hours on this podcast. I can tell you, to start with myself personally, what keeps me up at night is, as Dr. Bedrick was just saying, it's the regulation and lack thereof that really worries me. And as for hope, I really hope I never have to do another administrative task again. So, Dr. Anto.
In terms of education space, obviously that's important to this podcast and its audience. I'm really excited about the applications for education, for analysis of, for example, procedures you do and the sort of feedback that you can get to continue to grow and push yourselves technically. What keeps me up at night, or what worries me, is very similar to our first case that you posed to us, that with the adaptation of these really amazing and powerful models, that one might not take the time to gain the experience to know when not to truly use it. And so ultimately, our trainees need to develop the wisdom and prudence to know when to deviate from the model, when the algorithm's not right.
Who's next?
So,
Professor Spector?
Sure. Not to be too tongue in cheek, but what keeps me up at night is people who think regulations are going to save us from this.
It's far too complex and far too vast, and it's in way too many private hands, and the politics aren't there. Like, we are going to be so far past like the horse being out of the barn, right? Like, the horse is going to be like halfway to Europe by the time we get around to regulating this. So I do think that we are going to have to look at different kinds of internal and industry governance models. Something that gives me hope is that, oh my God, I love it for research. Like, you are going to have to pry my AI tools out of my cold, dead hands for research.
Agreed.
I think the first time that I sat there with like some of these literature review tools that are like built into the U of M library that goes straight to my Zotero, that input into my article, like, I literally cried. The amount of time it can save and like doing structured abstracts and all of that stuff. It's an amazing tool. And I'm so excited to keep using it and to help people figure out how to use it in safe ways. And that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, I think I'll go on the trend of training. So it keeps me up at night as someone who's been invested in training new people, either it was flying airplanes or now as a trainee in surgery, and seeing these tools take off at a speed which we don't have the ability to train. We're way behind the power curve. That horse is almost to Europe, probably mostly through Russia right now. So that's what keeps me up at night, is that we have a lot of very powerful tools being disseminated at a rapid rate without the training to support it. But what gives me hope is that there's excitement about it. And it is permeating places that I never thought I'd see. I'd never think that being someone that knows a lot about AI would be a desirable skill to have in a surgical world, but yet it is. And I think that people are more interested in learning how it works, and that enthusiasm, that curiosity is what gives me hope that people will want the training when we can get around to making it.
So I'm kept up at night by many of the same things that other people have brought up, but the enthusiasm with which I've seen people like jump onto tools that they'll admit that they don't understand, that they've seen make errors that they don't even want to use, but they feel like they have to, right? Like the sort of the psychology of that keeps me up at night. I do not understand it. And so I worry about things being adopted because people feel like they have to, or everyone else is doing it, or if they don't, someone else will, or whatever. And that like turning off the part of your brain that does critical thinking. That keeps me up at night. I'm excited by a lot of the same things other people said. Using this for research is amazing. In my research, using on clinical records and medical notes for so many years, every project people came to me for ideas with, I would say, great, give me a research assistant in a year to do data labeling. And we'll, maybe we'll have something that'll kind of work after a year. And now I can say, awesome, we can probably bang out a prototype this week. Like, the tools are so much better. And that just opens the door to a lot of science that we couldn't do before. So that gives me a lot of hope.
I guess that leaves me last. What gives me hope is the fact that we're actually having these conversations, and that we know there are people that are interested in hearing and being a part of the conversations. But actually, at the same time, what keeps me up at night is the fact that we need to have more of these conversations, and we might be the leading edge that's actually trying to converse about this, whereas others are willing to allow the automation bias and the hype drive application.
Well, thank you everybody again. I mean it when I say I wish we had 5 more hours and if I could only use ChatGPT to get a copy of each of your brains and summarize it, it would be incredible. So thank you again. And from behind the knife, dominate the day.
Be sure to check out our website at www.behindtheknife.org. Download our free app available for Apple, iOS, and Android. Simply search for Behind the Knife in the App Store or Google Play to download the app. In the app, you can listen to our episodes, watch high-yield videos, and even access our premium content, including our oral board reviews and trauma video atlas. You can also follow us on Twitter at Behind the Knife and on Instagram at Behind the Knife Podcast. If you like what you hear, please be sure to leave us a review. Content produced by Behind the Knife is intended for health professionals and is for educational purposes only. We do not diagnose, treat, or offer patient-specific advice. Thank you for listening. We appreciate your support.
Until next time, dominate the day.